Genesis is America's newest luxury car brand, founded in 2015 not as the answer to Lexus, but as South Korea's answer to BMW and Mercedes. Like many new brands, value was definitely a strong reason to buy the first few models of Genesis. But this is very different. This is the 2025 Genesis GV80 Coupe, and this is more expensive than a BMW X6, at least as far as the base pricing goes. And that means this conversation has to be very different. Does Genesis have what it takes to compete directly without that value proposition? Or is there something we're missing on the surface of the new GV80 Coupe? Let's find out. So let's talk about the design first. And while I'm doing so, big shout out to Sophie and Bay from Redline Reviews. He's handling the camera for me, so I'll wave there to him and direct him around for the shots that we're interested in here. Up front, it looks very much like the regular GV80, but there are some changes. We get this sort of double basket weave sort of grille here. I really like this look. It gives it more of an architectural feel with these little bumps that actually come out kind of like pyramids in between the regular basket weave. Also, the chrome is sort of smoked chrome. It's not a complete blackout package, but it's certainly darker and a bit more subtle than we find on the regular GV80. Now, like the updated GV80, we have the new multi-module LED headlights, and that's a really distinctive and cool touch. Of course, we have full LED turn signals in this double stripe design as well. And as we come around to the side, if we come around this way, you'll notice that that double stripe is repeated across the vehicle as well, really giving it that signature hallmark. All GV80 Coupes are going to have the same sort of tire sizes that we find in the regular GV80. This has the up-level wheel, 22-inch wheels. 20-inch wheels are standard. The black Genesis brakes are standard. 265 40R22 tires are the tires all the way around. And I will say that although I think that the tire size is appropriate for the base model, I would love to see a performance package where we got wider tires in the back. It definitely fills out the wheel wells in something like a BMW X6 that we have some crazy wide tires back there. And I would love to see that in the GV80 Coupe as well. We find the smoked chrome all the way around, down below, around the greenhouse here as well. And then of course, we get the big change for the GV80 Coupe, and that all happens right back here. It has a sportback, liftback, sportback style, whatever we want to call this particular design, and of course, a hatch that's certainly more horizontal than it is vertical. Although I will say that the GV80 has a pretty raked design for a three-row SUV already, so according to Genesis, it has a relatively minimal impact on cargo capacity. I don't know exactly how they're measuring that, and we don't have final specifications yet. Hopefully we'll find some soon. The other big thing you'll notice, no rear windshield wiper. So if you're seeing sort of inflated Genesis sedan, I don't think you're wrong. We have a twin spoiler arrangement back here with the backup camera slightly off to one side, and again, that twin stripe design to the taillights. The other change happens down here at the bottom of the bumper, where we find visible exhaust tips rather than having them tucked up underneath the car. And it is sort of a quad tip design. Let's take a look inside. Yep, there are actually 4 exhaust tips, sort of a twin exhaust with resonators on the back, ending in 2 separate tips there. And then we get the same sort of details back here that we find up front with those cross hatches and full LEDs all the way around, including those backup lights down there at the bottom. Now let's take a look under the hood. Genesis decided that the GV80 Coupe should be basically the top-end trim of the GV80 lineup. So there is no 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. There's really no base model. That's probably the best way to think of the GV80 Coupe. This is top-end trim only with an optional engine that we don't find in the regular GV80. Things start out with a 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6 producing 375 horsepower, but if you want more oomph, you want this engine. This is basically borrowed out of the Genesis G90 sedan, and this adds an E-supercharger. So it's an electrically driven supercharger, and it's kind of an interesting design. The extra power is not due just to the electric supercharger. We actually have different turbochargers in this model as well. They're slightly larger, which gives us more boost at higher RPMs. The problem with bigger turbos usually is that you get more lag, and that's where the E-supercharger comes in, because this can deliver about 30% more torque at lower RPMs versus the other 3.5-liter V6. That's the reason you want the upgraded engine. It also comes with a slight fuel economy improvement benefit because it has a mild hybrid system as well. It's a 48-volt system driving the mild hybrid and the E-supercharger as well. Like the regular GV80, this is going to send power to the ground via a standard 8-speed automatic transmission and a standard all-wheel drive system that has a strong rear power bias. That's one big difference between the GV80 and the Lexus or the Acura competition, which are both front-wheel drive based vehicles. This is an entirely different animal. And that's one of the other things about Genesis. Since their very introduction, they decided not to go down the same road that Acura and Lexus did, which is part of why they're trying to target BMW and Mercedes a bit more directly. At this point in time, there is no such thing as a front-wheel drive Genesis, and it doesn't appear that there ever will be. Now let's talk about front seat comfort. It's pretty similar to the regular GV80, which means that on the driver's side, we have a more adjustable seat in the top-end trims than on the passenger side. That's one thing I would love to see Genesis address because it is something we find in most of the European competition. For instance, we find inflatable bolsters here and the front seat massage function, but that's something you don't find on the passenger side. That logically helps reduce costs and perhaps improve long-term reliability, but it's again something that I would love to see. We have a powered tilt telescopic steering column and about the same kind of headroom that we find in the regular model. This big panoramic moonroof that you'll see in just a moment, that's standard in every GV80 trim. Now let's check out the back seats, because obviously there is a bit of a change back here. And that change is going to be, if I scoot all the way over to this side, headroom. It's still actually pretty generous, and I was surprised by that. I had expected this to be a really tight back seat, but you know, I have maybe about 3/4 of an inch of headroom left. I'm 6 feet tall, definitely enough legroom back here sitting with the front seats adjusted for me. And the driveline hump is relatively small as well. Even though this is a rear wheel drive vehicle, they do manage to keep a lot of those drivetrain components pretty low. Now, unlike some of the European competition, we only find 3-zone automatic climate control in the GV80, not 4-zone. Although we do find these really cool sort of carrot red orange seat belts. I think that's a really cool touch. And this model has power rear seats. So you can see we have a power recline mechanism there and they power slide forward and backward. Although I'm not entirely clear why you might want to power forward except for increasing the cargo capacity in the rear. Now, speaking of the cargo area in the back, actually one quick step, we do have soft close doors all the way around, which is a nice touch. So you just sort of stop them there and then they soft close themselves. That's a feature you don't find standard in most of the competition or even available in some. Now back here in the cargo area, Genesis says that this has only 2 cubic feet of cargo room less than the GV80. I'm not entirely clear how they're measuring that, whether that is just below the rear head restraints like some car companies will measure, or whether it includes the entire volume up to the ceiling. The GV80 Coupe is a little bit longer than the regular GV80, and that may be where some of this difference comes from. So maybe they got a little bit more horizontally and they lost a little bit vertically back here. We have a hard cargo cover on top that helps block a bit more sound, but it's not quite as convenient as the soft roller kind. With those front seats slid forward, there's still a decent amount of legroom there, and then you can move your cargo forward to expand the cargo area. Under the floor, no spare tire, but we do have a tire mobility kit and a little bit of extra storage space. Going all the way down the rabbit hole, there's a little bit more storage right there, and keep in mind this was designed to accommodate a 3rd row, at least in the regular SUV version, so there does appear to be a reasonable amount of wasted space back here. I don't know whether you get more room if you opt for the non-mild hybrid version, but of course that 48-volt lithium-ion battery pack has to live somewhere. I am surprised, however, they didn't change that cargo mold to give you more storage space around the battery. Now let's take a more detailed look around the inside. We have the rear view camera right there, a feature that I'm not the biggest fan of. Sunglass holder up here, touch buttons for the map lights, and controls for the large panoramic moonroof. Again, that is standard. Over here we have slide to the side sun visors, and we have the microphones for the active noise cancellation system. The panoramic sunroof is not the biggest that I've ever seen, but it is a 2-pane design, and the panes do open with a powered sunshade right there. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and the front passenger, again in that sort of carrot red color right there, and adjustable headrests. This upholstery is a little bit different than what we find in the regular GV80. They have altered the style of the stitching just a little bit for this model, but a lot of the features and functions remain the same. Again, not the same kind of adjustability over there on the passenger side as the driver's side, but we do have these adjustment buttons so that way your kids in the back can really annoy the front passenger by moving them forwards and backwards while you're driving along. Moving over to the front doors, lots of soft touch and stitched materials happen over here. We find carbon fiber trim in this model. Wood is also available depending on the version of the GV80 Coupe you get, and this has the ultramarine blue interior. As we see in other Genesis models, there aren't quite as many different color combinations available when we're talking about exterior versus interior colors, but I do think they've done a good job having a nice color palette for something like this. We have the Bang & Olufsen speakers you can see over there on the doors, lots of stitching down there at the bottom of the door panel, and then even down here at the bottom of the door, we have soft touch materials right there around that speaker grille. Moving up to the dashboard, we have a stitched dashboard upper there with that same sort of contrasting stitching. Again, more of a horizontal theme, also borrowed out of the updated GV80. There's a pan out so you can see how everything ties together. And then we have this big LCD right here, spanning from the instrument cluster to this sort of blank section, all the way over here to the infotainment section with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Genesis says that this will support wireless smartphone projection as well, but at this point in time, this particular software version does not have that function. It's worth noting that the internet connectivity feature apparently will be standard for the first owner for the lifetime that they're owning this Genesis. That's definitely a big differentiation between this and the German competition that usually just has a trial subscription phase, or perhaps a 3-year subscription to match the term of the average lease. Going on down here, we have a pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment. It's not quite as deep as some. I suspect an 11-inch tablet computer would not fit inside. All these plastics around here, these are all soft touch as well, just as you'd expect in something with an $80,000 price point. Before we go over to the driver's side, let's talk about the center console. We have a combination of physical and touch controls for the infotainment system and the climate control. The climate control gets its own touch LCD right there in the middle of everything, and then physical knobs for the temperature, volume, things like that. I think this is a little bit better laid out than in some of the other Genesis models, but I would prefer physical buttons rather than the touch buttons that we see here. And I'm wondering how well this black plastic will hold up, whether it will get scratched over time or not. This particular car only has 106 miles on it, so it's a little bit too early to tell. More carbon fibers happening down here. Under this little door, we find a wireless charging mat, USB input, and a USB charge port, also a 12-volt port. The rotary style shifter, that's down here, park in the middle. We then have an infotainment control knob, so you can either touch it or you can use the knob, whichever one you'd prefer. We then have the fingerprint recognition sensor right there that we find in other Genesis models as well. The drive mode selector, that's back there. We have a lock mode to enable the center coupling lock to send more power to the front axle when needed. 2 big cup holders, and then this sort of bifold split center console. Keep in mind, this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, so there's not a lot of room. You could take that out, but you probably couldn't fit, half gallon of milk in there or anything like that. So it's maybe about 6 or 7 inches deep. Going back to the driver's side, again, we have that full LCD instrument cluster. The design does change a little bit based on the drive mode that you're in, and there are a few other skins that you can select from as far as the background, but this is not as adjustable as most of the European full LCD clusters, and you'll never get anything along the lines of a full moving satellite imagery map or anything like that like you do find in some modern Audis. That's one thing I would still love to see Genesis modify, would be updating their instrument cluster software to make it a bit more competitive with some of those European options. We do, however, have a big full-color heads-up display, and I really like the size and the positioning of this big LCD in the dashboard. It looks better integrated than we find in some vehicles, but it's not over the top like perhaps some Cadillac models can be with that really huge display. The steering wheel, that's a nice, comfortable leather-wrapped unit with a leather-wrapped airbag cover. Again, the contrasting stitching there. And if you're not a fan of the touch buttons that we find in some European options, don't worry. We have mostly physical buttons here for things like the adaptive cruise control, lane centering, etc. On this side, we have a little touch control that's used to control that little widget section inside the LCD instrument cluster. But aside from that, everything else here is a physical button. Before we move on, let's take a look at the native software interface. If we choose the mapping interface here, you'll notice the map moving over here then merges onto the instrument cluster section of the display. So it looks a little bit better integrated than when you're using Apple CarPlay. The software is definitely easy to use and snappy, and there's a lot of functionality going on in here. And then again, you have all the connected services for the lifetime of the original owner. The other thing to note about this interior, going back to the value that we were talking about earlier in the video, is that most of what you see in here is actually standard in the GV80 Coupe, and that's because it's based off of the prestige trim of the GV80. So things like the heads-up display, the softer touch materials, etc., where things are optional on the regular GV80, they become standard by the large measure up here in the GV80 Coupe. So it's definitely one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're comparing this against some of the German options where vinyl upholstery is going to be standard, and here we have the upgraded Napa leather upholstery standard in every GV80 Coupe. All right, it's time to get the GV80 Coupe out on the road, and with me is Sofian from Redline Reviews. 0 to 60 times preliminarily out here, about 5.8 seconds.
Yeah, that's what we got in my video, and we actually finally got the launch control to engage, and that time is good. What do you think?
It's good.
Yeah.
It is definitely faster than the last 0 to 60 time I got in the regular GV80. And it is a little bit swifter than the Type S, MDX Type S in our testing, but it's not going to set anybody's hair on fire if you're driving an X6.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that BMW is the speed king. We'll do it in like 5 seconds flat.
Yeah,
but
it's really shockingly fast.
Right, well, that's because the Germans tend to underrate their engines.
Mm-hmm.
This engine is a good engine. It just, I wonder if it's actually making the 409 that they're claiming. But it's a great powertrain.
I would assume it's got to be making all 400 horsepower. It has a really great feel to it, but it does appear that the gearing, especially in lower gears, is not as aggressive as that CF transmission that the BMW uses.
Yes.
Let's go ahead and merge on to this whatever this is, highway, byway. I'm not sure what the Minnesotans call 55, but we'll see what we can do here once this truck gets out of the way. This is actually maybe a good time to test out that Sport Plus mode here. Let's see how this goes. Ooh.
Oh, feels good off the line.
Good pull. You can tell that that first gear is not as low as it could be because there's a little bit of a delay initially, but then the pull really is quite good after that.
Yeah, and the shift shock is definitely noticeable in Sport Plus. Like, it's trying to make you like aware you're driving the sportier version of this car.
Yes, we are
And I
having
appreciate
sporty
it.
fun.
And also, it sounds good. It's like a fake sound. What do you think of the sound?
It does. Yeah, and it's like, even outside, the engine sounds good. So on the inside, obviously, some of this is piped in, but I think the basis of the sound is pretty decent.
Yeah.
And passing power is definitely good. You can really feel that there's a decent amount of low-end torque there. You know, Genesis is quick to point out that this is not the sportiest interpretation of Genesis.
Yeah, that's what these orangey, carrot orange seatbelts are going to hint at.
Yes, so Magma's coming. We don't know what the performance letter or name or whatever exactly will be in the Genesis lineup, but there will be higher performance Genesis models coming in the future.
Yes.
And maybe that's why we don't find staggered tires on this model. No big 315s or 305s in the back, just 265s all the way around.
Right, yeah, no, that could be the case with them saving that. I'm just hoping that the Magma has like 500, at least 500 plus horsepower.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued to see what that future could hold because Genesis doesn't have an engine currently in production that would be that powerful. They could add a mild hybrid system, or sorry, a full hybrid system to this same drivetrain, obviously, and boost the power. That could be a fun alternative. Right. Or they could, you know, bring back that 5-liter V8 and stick some turbos on it.
That would be awesome. I doubt that. I
doubt it too.
I could see them doing a plug-in hybrid though.
Yes.
Like, I really would like to see Genesis go back into the hybrid and plug-in hybrid space because I think it was a mistake for like this brand and even like Acura, for example, to be skipping hybrids, going straight to full electrification because a lot of manufacturers are backpedaling now.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what that transition could mean for Genesis because back there in the trunk, there is a reasonable amount of room for a battery.
Yes, there is.
Now, the other thing we should touch on is just sort of general drivability because that is one reason to get the E-supercharged V6. The auto start-stop system is definitely smoother, and I would say in stop and go and slow and go traffic, not only is that part smoother, but it gets up and goes faster when the engine has restarted.
Yeah, I agree because every time I would drive the regular V6, first thing I would do is I shut off the auto start-stop because it was super jerky, and it just made me not enjoy the car because it's a luxury vehicle. You want it to be smooth and refined, and that's where the auto start-stop and the 48-volt system really improves the drivability.
But unlike the Mercedes EQ Boost systems, it doesn't have an electric air conditioning compressor. So, you know, right now, I don't know where the temperature is 87 degrees outside.
It's
you know,
humid out there
It's
too.
a little humid out there, a little muggy. And when we come to a stop here, it's going to want to turn off the engine. And, you know, I would rather have some air conditioning on. Let's see. One advantage to those other mild hybrid systems out there is that electric air conditioning compressor.
Yeah, and you had mentioned Mercedes is the only one, I think is what you said, that does that?
Yeah, as far as I know, Mercedes is the only one that I can think of currently that has any sort of mild hybridization with an electric air conditioning compressor. Everything else basically is a full hybrid.
Yeah, and that's what I really appreciate about when I would drive any new Mercedes with their EQ Boost is the AC would stay on because I think it's even more unacceptable if you're driving a luxury brand, the car shuts off to save fuel and then the air conditioning shuts off.
Now, handling is definitely solid in the GV80, whether we're talking about the SUV or this coupe. It depends, of course, on what exactly you're going to compare this to and cross-shop it against. It's going to feel very different from a Lexus RX, including that RX 500h hybrid with the electric motors in the back, or the Acura MDX Type S, because we have that eLSD in the back, but we also have the ability to send basically 100% of the power to the rear whenever it wants to.
Yeah, that's definitely a selling feature of the GV80s. If you want something that's rear-wheel drive, that's built off of a bespoke platform, because like you mentioned, the Lexus and the Acura technically are built off of front-wheel drive architectures, and it certainly makes this car more appealing, especially if you're an enthusiast.
And it's going to make this feel, again, an awful lot more like the BMW or the Mercedes, exactly what Genesis was going for. And that is, you know, kind of the interesting twist with Genesis is that since their inception, they've gone after this segment differently than the Japanese competitors, where Acura and Lexus started initially with front-wheel drive models. Yes, Lexus had the LS, but they also started with the ES, basically a Lexus Camry. And there is no corollary, oddly enough, in the Genesis lineup.
Yeah, I mean, really the only vehicle that shares any kind of parts with the regular Hyundai or Kia is the GV60.
Yeah,
because it's built off of their electric architecture.
Exactly, and they were smart enough not to make a front-wheel drive GV60. So you know, it's the higher performance models. Of course, if anybody's paying attention, you know, in the lineage, the genetic dynasty of this Genesis product line, there was of course the Kia Stinger and the Kia K900.
Yes.
But you know, there's never been a Hyundai in the lineup with any of these same sort of parts.
That's where I think Genesis is going in the right direction. They are targeting the European players, and by them offering, you know, a coupe SUV, they're really kind of going after a marketplace that the Europeans started with the X6.
They definitely are, and you know, versus the X6, I will say that the BMW does come across as simultaneously sportier and more comfortable, I would say, but some folks might not be interested in that because of long-term expenses. So one of the reasons is that BMW has a fantastic air suspension, and the X5 rides like a dream, especially with that air suspension. But if you want a sportier version, you can definitely get sportier tunes of the X6. You know, long-term, those airbags can cost $1,500 a pop when they have to get replaced. This suspension is going to be a lot cheaper to maintain, so definitely an advantage there. And some people prefer the more traditional, you know, steel spring feel. I'd also say that the steering here, it's not as engaging as the X6's steering, but the chassis poise and the amount of power we get in the rear and that rear axle, it really does have a solid Germanic feel to it that way.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the sportiest driving car in the class, but I think it's a great middle ground. It has a lot of qualities that I think people in this space are looking for: comfortable, quiet cabin as well, good power, and competent handling when you start pushing it. I mean, you definitely feel the weight of this thing, and the suspension still feels soft to me. But that's kind of what's important, is people value more ride quality and luxury versus, you know, outright handling, because some of those, like the BMWs, you get the M versions, they ride way too stiff.
Yes, they can get very, very, very firm. And you know, it is worth noting, this does get pretty firm. If I move this over to Sport and Sport Plus, I can now feel every little imperfection on this road. This road's actually not badly paved, especially for the Midwest. But you know, we're definitely getting a reasonable amount of that in here.
Right, and that's because also we're driving a model that has 22-inch wheels, so if you want the softer ride, get the 20s on the base car, which isn't really that basic.
That's true, you know, but you know, I think this is a really good balance of everything together. You know, on a road like this, you can floor it, you can get 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds, just after that initial little delay there with the gearing. And when the road starts to wind up here like this, you can have significantly more fun in this than in most of the competition outside of the BMW and Mercedes, I would say. This is pretty close to the Germans, though. I will say I find this more fun than the Audi Q8. The Audi Q8 feels much more front heavy than this. I would also say, depending on exactly what your cross shops are, this is certainly going to be more engaging than something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee, also rear wheel drive, but certainly more off-road focused, much higher center of gravity, etc. It doesn't feel as sporty as something like this.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Now, obviously, we don't have this at home, so I can't run this through any cabin noise testing, but I think that Genesis has done a good job keeping the cabin quiet. We have that firm, hard divider back there between the cabin and the cargo area that certainly helps quiet things down. And then, of course, there's the fact that those tires aren't as meaty as some of the German options.
I'm impressed with the level of refinement this car has. I also noticed as we go through some of the bumpy roads out here, there's not a single squeak and rattle in this car. So.
No, it feels really, really solid. And I will say, you know, off-camber situations where, you know, going up driveways, etc., there's no flex going on with this body. They've done a really good job on the structural rigidity. Where I think Genesis really needs to do some work is the fuel economy. And, you know, it's not bad. And 10 years ago, this would be absolutely, you know, middle class for the fuel economy. But in 2024, you know, you will get significantly better fuel economy in the BMW.
Oh yeah, the BMW is rated at like 2326, while this is 1822. I mean, 1822 doesn't sound bad until you put it next to the BMW, and you wonder, why is this so much thirstier?
And in our testing, The GV80, the regular GV80, you know, gets almost the EPA scores in reality, whereas the BMW actually gets better than the EPA scores for most people in regular driving.
So that's kind of like, it shows you just how efficient and powerful BMW's engines are, which they kind of always have been, but
Yeah.
this does compete favorably, I guess, with an MDX Type S. Fuel economy on that engine's like 17, 21.
Yeah, and the MDX fuel economy is not great either, mind
No.
you. But you know, there are some hybrids and plug-in hybrids out there that you can cross-shop against, something like a GV80, not necessarily the coupe here, but the regular GV80. There are some corollaries there. And I will say, you know, back on the BMW, like I said in your video, you know, in our Grenadier, we have a BMW inline-6 engine in that vehicle, and it gets about the same combined score as this.
And it's a brick.
Yeah, and it's a 6,000-pound, you know, moving living room. I mean, it's about as square as that house over there. And it is shockingly good on the fuel economy side. This is not bad, but again, it could be a little better. The hybrid is a little bit better, though, than the non-hybrid.
Yeah, it's 2 mpg improvement in the city, which makes sense because it's able to use that electric boost. But I was hoping for a little bit more.
Yeah.
Especially on the highway figure, it's the same as the non-supercharged version.
Yeah, I was too. Now, you know, Genesis has said that there are going to be some hybrids coming soon. We just don't know exactly what those will be. You know, we already mentioned that, but you know, let's hope that that comes sooner rather than later. Now, Sofian, before we get to, you know, my usual pricing section, and sorry guys if there's a little bit of overlap in this clip and what's going to come later, how do you feel about the price point on this GV80? I'm kind of conflicted because I think it's still a really good value, but on the surface of it, it just doesn't have that strong value proposition that Genesis was known for. I mean, once upon a time, you bought the Genesis because it was 25% less than the BMW.
Right.
And just 10 years later, we now have a Genesis that is more expensive starting than the BMW.
Yeah, no, you bring up a really good point because that was a big selling feature for Genesis because they were a new brand. You know, they were a they're the only Korean luxury brand, I think, in the world. And they had that value proposition. Now, I do still think they have the value proposition.
I would agree.
But you also have to, I think what people are going to miss is the fact that the starting price of this car is $5,000 more than an X6 or a Q8 or a GLE, but that's because this car only comes fully loaded in the Prestige trim.
Exactly. And that is kind of the tricky part in a way. It's like, yes, it's great value, but to explain to the viewer, the customer, if you're a dealer and you're trying to sell it, or if you guys are, you know, the viewers that are watching this video, I think that's a harder sell to be like, you know, guys, it is, you know, $5,000 more than the BMW, but you get all this extra stuff. And a comparable BMW is going to be, you know, $5,000 or $6,000 more at least than this, right? But then at the same time, that off-the-shelf, off-the-cuff price is going to cause some shock.
Yeah, the initial high starting price is going to give people a pause. Like, why would I spend 80 grand on a Genesis when I can get a BMW for 75?
Yeah.
Now, because some people, they're just interested in the badge. They're like, well, the BMW is cheaper, but I don't care that it doesn't come with this and this
Exactly.
and that. So I think Genesis should offer a lower price, like advanced trim. I'm hoping that they will at some point, even though they told us that most of their clientele actually do buy the top trims.
Yeah, and I believe it, because I mean, this interior is fantastic. And, you know, this is not necessarily a knock on Genesis that I think that the price tag is going to cause some shock. I think the problem in a way is simply the Genesis logo and people not being familiar with it. Because if you do get in one, I think you'd say, wow, this is a really great interior. You know, why would I get a base BMW X6 with literally vinyl seats and, you know, a steering wheel that's not quite as snazzy as far as the airbag cover, and the base versions and the dashboard materials aren't going to be as nice in those base models. Yeah, you can get the better stuff in there, but it's going to cost you more. And that is I just think it's a slightly trickier sell than previously, where it was just like 25% less straight off the bat, come on in, and that's part of the value. Right,
because this car is also more expensive than its Japanese rivals.
That's true.
That could be a problem for some people.
And for me, though, I think that's totally justified, because this, I mean, the interior here is a step above what we find in the Acura or the Lexus. I actually found the interior in the last 2 Lexuses that we have both driven kind of disappointing. The GX and the TX, I mean, they come across as pretty plain.
Yeah, the interior of this car reminds me of what Lexus should be.
Yeah.
Like Lexus should be like at this level, and they've decided to kind of cut back on materials and wood and real metal trim, and they claim it's what their customers are, you know, going for. They don't care as much, but I also think cost cutting, obviously.
Yeah, I have a feeling it's got to be cost cutting. Because like in a Lexus TX, you can get the TX, obviously not the same class, but the RX goes up to almost the same price tag. If you get the RX 500H with everything,
Right.
you know, it can get to the starting price this basically.
It can, yeah,
you
but
know.
it's like 70 to 75.
Yeah,
Something like that.
and that's pretty close to this GV80. But you'll notice in its interior, it's not going to feel this comfortable, and it's certainly not going to have this much power in the rear-wheel drive bias.
Right. I will say that I like the Lexus seats a little bit more. For me, they're more comfortable because there's more padding in them. But when you look at the materials and the authentic materials and the wood and the metal trim, this definitely has Lexus beat.
And I will say that's something that you should probably spend a lot of time in if you're considering something like this, is check out the seats, because you weren't the only one that mentioned that the seats felt a little bit hard. Now for me, I think the driver's seat's pretty comfortable. I appreciate the inflatable bolsters. For me, it's more of the, you know, why is that seat not the same as this seat? That's my only complaint on the seats.
I'm shafted here. I don't have the massage seats, or I don't have the inflatable bolster.
Yeah, and anybody that's been married a reasonable amount of time, you know, sometimes there are arguments about what that other seat looks or feels like in a car, because, you know, some people want more equitable seating arrangements. Now let's get back to the pricing and the value proposition, because that is where the GV80 Coupe really is different than the first few Genesis models that we saw in the United States, where they were significantly less expensive, especially when we're talking about base price versus most of the competition, including the Japanese entries in this segment. This, again, is very different. As equipped here, it's $87,750, and it started at $79,950. Now, on the one hand, that's only $350 more than a comparable GV80 without the coupe styling. But, of course, it's actually more expensive than the base price on a BMW X6 or an Audi Q8 or the Mercedes-Benz GLE, etc., etc., etc. Really, it's just the Porsche Cayenne Coupe that starts higher than this model. You could even get something like a Polestar 3 for less than this GV80 Coupe. Now, on the other hand, there is still a lot of value going on. If I attempt to comparably equip a BMW X6 to this specific GV80, then it's actually going to be a little bit more expensive. Remember that the X6 does start with vinyl upholstery, and this starts with leather. It also comes with a ton of standard equipment, which is why it's so much more expensive than the base version of the GV80 SUV. The question, I think, ultimately is the Genesis brand strong enough to justify an $80,000 starting point? Or am I looking at this wrong? Am I simply failing to realize that this is just the upper end trim of the GV80? Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. My personal opinion is that yes, Genesis has what it takes to compete at this price point when we're talking about the content of the vehicle. The interior design, the fit and finish, the materials quality on the inside, I think it's fantastic. I also think this is simply better looking than the current generation BMW X6. I actually don't mind the BMW front end design, but I prefer the more elegant and restrained design that we find on this GV80. The question is, will the average luxury car shopper actually think the same way? Also, it is worth noting that this may be more expensive starting than some of those competitors, but it's actually going to lease less. And most people in the luxury segment at this price point lease their vehicles. And this is going to be several $1,000s less in terms of the total lease cost, with less down than the comparable lease deals that we find currently on the X6 or the GLE or even the Audi Q8. So with all of that in mind, let me know what you think about the GV80 Coupe. Did Genesis do the right thing with this model, or should they have been maybe a little bit more aggressive? Should they have given it even more power? Just over 400 horsepower is pretty lovely, but I would also love to see a GV80 with 500 horsepower, even if that meant adding a hybrid system under the hood. Now, we all know that Genesis has said that hybrids and perhaps plug-in hybrids are in their future, but we don't know exactly what that means yet and what form that will take under the hood of their next generation products. But at this point in time, you just have the choice of 375 horsepower or 409 horsepower in this coupe. And that is indeed one reason to get it over the regular GV80, is that we do get more power and more performance. See all of you later.